Comedy in gaming is really interesting to me. It follows a lot of different rules than comedy does in other mediums. Ghostbusters, Flight of the Conchords, and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy all have their jokes directly shown to you. Sure, some jokes can be more subtle than others, but the fact of the matter is that in linear media, jokes are fed to you on a conveyor belt. This isn't a bad thing at all, it's just the nature of the beast. If you see a joke that really makes you laugh in Ghostbusters, it's just a reward that you get for picking a funny movie. In gaming, however, the comedy works a bit differently. The kind of comedy that's unique to games asks you to put in a little bit more effort to get your comedic payoff. Let's start with what is probably the first thing that jumps in your head when I talk about funny things happening in games: ragdoll physics. This stuff is just plain great. My first memories of really laughing at a game were playing Grand Theft Auto 4 at sleepovers as a kid. Like most people who'd played that game, we'd intentionally drive right down the sidewalks, plowing into tons of pedestrians. Sure, the wanton disregard for social norms is a lot of the fun of that game, but I was always more interested in those ragdolls. The game had a mode where you could plop the camera right onto the hood of your car and watch pedestrians roll off of your windshield one after the other, and the amount of humor that can be extracted from this is just insane. It's just one great slapstick moment after the other, and you never know how the next one is going to be subtly different. The amount of pure joy that can be extracted from the endless buggy ragdoll physics of the later 2000s need not be explained to anyone who's played Gary's mod. But speaking of slapstick and Grand Theft Auto, it'd be crazy of me not to mention Postal 2. Postal 2 is a great intersection between slapstick and a lot of my other points that I'll cover up next. It's a game whose actual writing basically never gets a laugh out of me, save for the Postal Dude himself, but it's still one of the funniest games I've ever played. The mechanics encourage players to create their own slapstick comedy in a way that's 100% unique to gaming. The dismemberment system is incredibly liberal, the NPCs are designed to make you want to attack them, and a little bit of crack can fuel an entire evening's worth of cartoony violence. It's a picture-perfect example of a true sandbox game, a game with practically no ambitions outside of giving you a box of toys and reasons to play with them. So the over-the-top gore and the ridiculously powerful weapons make for some great slapstick, but what else does this game do to create some comedy? Well, it's a perfect example of simulation-driven comedy. For this, let's look at the ever-famous petition mission. One of your goals on Tuesday is to get 10 signatures for a petition, and the only way to do this is to go up to random people and ask them to sign. 90% of the time, the NPCs say no and insult you in some annoying way. By this point, you've realized that the game really doesn't punish you at all for just gunning down 50 people, so you get moments like this.
Would you please sign my petition?
No way, you freaking pinko.
You gotta be fucking kidding.
Hey!
That's the ticket.
Mommy!
Look, just sign the stupid petition. I've got stuff to do.
With the very simple narrative trick of making every NPC annoying and forcing you to interact with them, the game encourages you to play the role of the Postal Dude. That is to say, an absolute psychopath in this ridiculously violent cartoon. So that's all just an example of prompting the player to create their own chaos. The simulation is motivating the comedy, however, once that chaos is started, the simulation starts to create its own comedy, independent of the player. Maybe a cop accidentally shoots an armed NPC while trying to hit you, and that NPC pulls out their gun and a shootout starts. Maybe someone flees from the gunfire into someone's backyard and gets mauled by their dog. Maybe you bring the cops down on you while trying to complete an objective, and so the only way to finish that objective is the horribly violent way. It really does feel like anything can happen in this game, and because it's so dynamic and unpredictable, it always catches you off guard, and it's always funny. My personal favorite moment of this game was on Friday. I had just ran through a scrapyard full of angry dogs and befriended all of them with dog biscuits. They followed me through the level transition, and an NPC with a rocket launcher shot directly at us, sending 20 dogs flying into the sky in all directions. What makes it even better is that it always feels like you're the one who's responsible for whatever funny thing happened. After all, it's not like you had to shoot that guy who called you an asshole, prompting all of this chaos. So now we're getting onto the feeling like you earned a joke. Well, since a game tends to take much more time to get through than a film, album, or even some books, we've got the added investment it takes to feel like you've earned a different type of joke. A long, seemingly mundane setup that pays off with a smack in the face by a blunt, uncaring comedy brick. My personal favorite example of this, and my personal funniest moment in gaming, is a typically quiet, reserved moment in the first Portal. For about 3 hours, we've just been slowly making our way through this incredibly lonely, slightly horrifying testing facility, with only the company of the infinitely apathetic GLaDOS keeping us motivated. Well, when we get to Test Chamber 17, GLaDOS does her best to try and understand human emotions, for the sake of science.
The vital apparatus vent will deliver a weighted companion cube in 3, 2, 1.
Here's your new friend. It's a box. This box has a heart on it. Humans associate hearts with love. Love has been dispensed. Please continue testing. In my eye, there's never been a better example of blunt comedy. Sure, there are a handful of other jokes at the expense of GLaDOS' apathy for humans before this point, but the last 3 or so hours we've spent with this game were more or less all set up for this joke, and it's a joke that's delivered with 14 cold, emotionless words and a 1-second animation, and it may very well be my favorite joke in any media. This is another sort of joke that gaming is the absolute best at. The whole thing is perfectly utilitarian. The box serves the puzzle in the same way that a line of dialogue in a film could just be there to serve the plot. However, an expository line could easily have a joke put into it. As an example, let's look at my favorite line from one of my favorite comedies, Ghostbusters.
Dropping off or picking up?
Dropping off.
Just a moment.
It's just a great, simple line that shows how casually the Ghostbusters have started accepting presumed crazy people from the police. The bluntness of the comedy and Janine's no-bullshit temperament are the first things to spring to mind when you watch this scene, and then the purpose that the line serves to the plot comes a moment after. This is great for a film like Ghostbusters, and comedy films in general. I wouldn't have it any other way. But in a game like Portal, where the quote-unquote plot, the puzzle, is progressed by this cube, the cube's function to the puzzle is the first thing that comes to mind. Then, over the next few moments, you think more and more about what just happened, and that's when the comedy of the situation sneaks up on you. While that line in Ghostbusters is immediately funny, the companion cube's introduction is the sort of comedy that just gets funnier and funnier the more you think about it, which is fitting considering how much slower, longer, and quieter a game typically is compared to a film or a book. You get stuck in games from time to time, and you stop seeing new things every now and then, and this just gives you time to dwell on the jokes. Whereas in linear media, there aren't any breaks on the train, and a joke only has so much time to be dwelled on before the next joke comes in. Again, I'm not saying that one sort of comedy is better than the other, but this sort of joke is something that I think games have the power to pull off with a lot more grace than other media usually does. A good example of this sort of comedy being used in a film is Dr. Strangelove, a film that feels like it has practically zero punchlines until you finish it, realize what it was all about, and then come to laugh your ass off about it in retrospect or on repeat viewings. Dr. Strangelove and the Companion Cube introduction are both the sort of joke that's funnier in retrospect, but a game can afford to give you quiet time to dwell on the joke, while a film like Dr. Strangelove has to keep the plot moving, so you don't have ample time to consider the humor in what you've seen until the film's over. Let me pitch in another fantastic example of this sort of humor in a game, as it'll give me a chance to examine the most unique part of the Companion Cube joke, the setup that takes place over the entire runtime of the game up to that point. Prey, like Portal, is a quiet, mysterious, and unsettling game. It's got a lot of quiet time in which you can reflect on your character's situation, and it has a more overtly horrific atmosphere than Portal's creeping suspicions. Over the majority of your playthrough, something like 20 hours for a thorough first-timer, you'll occasionally read emails about a cargo handler named Grant Lockwood.
Hey, Jessica, got a minute?
It's my day off.
Yeah, but can you run me through the container docking procedure again? I missed the training session.
Ugh, Grant.
Please, if I ask Gus again, he'll lose his mind.
Are you at the crate docking control station?
Yes.
First, enter the handling number on the container you want to dock.
Where do I get the number?
Look at the container, Grant. It's stenciled on the outside. Once you enter the number, you should see some options pop up. Select dock. That's it.
The container just docks itself, right?
Yes, Grant. It docks itself. They are all self-piloting.
And I guess opens the container?
Yes. But both ends can never be open at the same time. That way the interior loading zone stays pressurized even when the cargo bay doors are open.
Okay, I think I got it. Thanks, Jess. Jess? Hey, you there? Okay, bye.
Over your entire playthrough, you'll occasionally, once every 2 hours or so, read about how this guy annoyed his manager over and over, missed training sessions, forgot how to run the cargo retriever system, asked stupid questions, and eventually you find out that he was fired and his tracking bracelet was disabled, which is why you can never find the guy's body. On my playthrough, I heard that this guy was meant to be on a shuttle ride back home, but he went missing sometime between his tracker deactivation and the shuttle's planned launch time. I went on an EVA mission to check out the remains of that shuttle, and sure enough, Grant was nowhere to be found. Much later in the game, I got access to the Chief of Security's computer and found the code for Grant Lockwood's bracelet, allowing me to reactivate it. Now that I was able to track him again, I realized that his body was way out in space, probably half a click away from the station. Well, all that was left to do was to use my EVA pack to fly out there and see if I could get some answers. The long flight out gave me plenty of time to come up with theories as to what the hell this guy was doing so far away from the station, and why he missed the shuttle. And by the time I was nearing his corpse, I started to take radiation damage, and that's when it occurred to me what the big metal ring around Talos 1 was for. It was a part of the magnetosphere that kept solar radiation away from the Talos crew. This guy must have been cooked by the radiation, because I couldn't survive out here for more than a few minutes at a time. Well, thanks to the increased EVA speed from my Artax propulsion system Gen 2 upgrade, I made it to Grant's body before too long, and you know what I found on him? The Artax propulsion Gen 3. This dude was so utterly, fantastically incompetent, and had so little understanding of space travel that he said, "Screw Transtar and screw their shuttle, I'm gonna fly back to Earth myself." Not once did this man consider fuel, oxygen, radiation, starvation, complicated flight trajectories, heat from the Earth's atmosphere, or even just how the hell he was supposed to land on Earth once he got back into its atmosphere. And he didn't even make it a mile away from Talos 1 before he was cooked in his EVA suit like a Hot Pocket. While the companion cube intro has to be my favorite joke in gaming, when I found Grant Lockwood's body with absolutely zero fanfare and figured out what his so-called plan was, my jaw hit the floor like it never has before, and it slowly morphed into a huge grin over the 10-minute EVA flight back to the nearest airlock. That is a hell of a joke. Some 20 hours of setup, and 3 words in a numeral for the punchline. That is masterful comedy right there, and the fact that it was my own curiosity that brought me here, and basically zero provocation from the game's plot whatsoever, made the joke all the sweeter. I just discovered what may very well be the stupidest character in any fiction I've ever encountered, and I did it all on my own. I don't think I've ever laughed that hard in my life. Half the reason I'm even making this video is so that I can share that story with you. Environmental storytelling is something that people are constantly praising games for. That sense of discovery just makes places like Rapture or Talos 1 feel so real. But environmental comedy, like the sudden radiation damage leading to the revelation of Grant Lockwood's idiocy, is just such an awesome facet of environmental storytelling. As I said, environmental storytelling makes the world feel so real, and when you discover a joke amongst all of that, it's just such a great contrast between your expectations and your eventual discovery that it's impossible not to laugh when it's done right. The contrast between the realism of good environmental storytelling and the silliness of a nice, bluntly stupid environmental detail is just a perfect recipe for comedy. One good example of this sort of thing is the crying couple in Half-Life 2. You first see this crying couple in the beginning of the game as you make your way through the apartment complex. It's a good piece of world building, really sells the whole downtrodden thing. It isn't funny whatsoever. A bit later, during the uprising, you find another couple playing out that same animation, and if you're like me, you just assume that Valve was reusing the animation. Well, then in Half-Life 2 Episode 1, you see this crying couple again, only this time they're just having a casual and slightly silly conversation, and you start to get suspicious.
So much for better living through science.
Dr. Kleiner says we can mate now. Not that I needed his permission.
What idiot put Kleiner in charge?
After taking out the autogun in Episode 2 and seeing this, it becomes clear that Valve wasn't just lazily reusing this very distinct animation over and over. It was all just a running gag. With games that have great environmental storytelling like Half-Life 2, discovering a fourth wall break amongst all of that realism just gives even more surrealism than a fourth wall break in a less believable setting. It's really fun stuff. So now we can get to that last type of comedy that I'll cover for today, surrealism. Specifically, surrealism from mods. There's nothing quite as jarring or funny as the first time you boot up Gary's mod and see something like this. G-Man may very well be the most mysterious character in any game. Everybody who grew up with these games has gone crazy at one point or another just trying to figure out what his motivations are. But thanks to the fun of comedy mods, you can just utterly take the piss out of characters like G-Man, and the once horrifying zombies of Ravenholm, which aren't scary at all anymore now that most of us have seen these models hundreds of times on GM Construct or other context-devoid settings. The fun of these sorts of mods that don't take themselves seriously whatsoever, such as Gary's mod, is to see things that we've got massive emotional investment in just completely bastardized and turned upside down. It's like watching an elementary school play of The Shining or Taxi Driver. It would be utterly hilarious to anyone who loved those films. Well, that brings me to the Half-Life 2 Beta Minimalist mod. This is a mod that aims to recreate a very early beta of Half-Life 2. It's super bare bones, but it's an interesting chance to look at how the vision for Half-Life 2 changed over its development. Let's play a scene from the final Half-Life 2 release and compare it to its counterpart from the beta.
Rise and shine, Mr. Freeman. Rise and shine. Not that I wish to imply you have been sleeping on the job. No one is more deserving of a rest, and all the effort in the world would have gone to waste until... well, let's just say your hour has come again. The right man in the wrong place can make all the difference in the world. So wake up, Mr. Freeman. Wake up and smell the ashes.
Gordon, you need to wake up and save City 17.
So yeah, this thing is a big joke. This is a mod that does technically recreate almost everything we know about the original story of Half-Life 2 before the 2003 leak that caused drastic changes to the final game. Everything, and I mean everything, is done about as poorly as it possibly can be done, and it's pure gold. For instance, here's Captain Vance's tragic death scene.
Gordon, that dropship's coming right for us.
This mod probably took a month tops to make, but even in a world with Cry of Fear, Research and Development, Minerva Metastasis, Death's Cold Embrace, and Thief 2X, Half-Life 2 Beta Minimalist might be my very favorite mod I've ever played. This thing's sense of humor is so in line of my own. It's not that the bad mic quality and the utterly stupid dialogue is all that funny, it's that this mod is one of the best games of all time if it were made by absolute morons who lack even the most basic of talents. That's a recipe for absolute perfection. Parodies tend to be pretty lame in the world of film, at least for my taste, but in the world of gaming, there's a whole lot going on behind the scenes to make something good, things you take for granted. In a good game, you just don't see things like this scene where I have to tank tons of damage for 10 seconds to get past a sniper. You don't see 10 minutes of elevator rides with absolutely nothing to look at or listen to, and you especially don't see this.
Gordon, you are in prison.
This is yet another type of comedy that's more or less exclusive to gaming. The closest analog I can think of in another medium would be YouTube poops or film edits like Home Stallone, taking something we're familiar with and changing it in just a few key ways to make it absolutely ridiculous.
Mr. Worf, pulverize a planet. You've just committed an act of utter barbarity. Well done.
There's something that all these types of comedy have in common, some more than others. Surrealism and a longer setup with a shorter payoff. A contrast between the inherent immersion of games, particularly a first-person one, and a completely silly moment is pure surrealism. Games, even as old as System Shock, Thief, and Resident Evil, are fantastic at immersion, and as graphics get more realistic, the ceiling for how immersive a game can get just gets higher and higher. When stupid, silly, or video gamey things happen in a setting that feels so real, it's such a great form of comedy. Just look at Resident Evil 7, a game that has absolutely zero punchlines that I can recall. It has fantastically realistic graphics, and it's mostly grounded in reality, at least more than something like Quake 3 or Team Fortress 2, and that realism is constantly fighting against the absolute campiness of everything that happens to Ethan over the course of the game. It's like Evil Dead 2, but if that film had incredible special effects that were indistinguishable from reality. Sure, the bad special effects are part of the fun of that film, but that campiness turns into fantastic surrealism when you combine it with such believable visuals. That surrealism is all over the place in game comedy, and it's just beautiful. Film, music, and gaming are more or less equal when it comes to their potential for comedy. They all have their own tools. But creating good comedy in a game requires so much finer a balance than simply having good writers, good delivery, and good comedic timing. Comedy in gaming is the ultimate balancing act between immersion and the intentional undermining of immersion. It's rare to see game comedy done perfectly, but when it is, it's some of my favorite comedy of all time.